Good afternoon. Welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar series, which is hosted by the Data Security Standards Committee. Today, we're going to be talking about the Qualified Integrators and Resellers Review and the updates to the program. Our agenda today, we have a few housekeeping items. I'll introduce our presenters and tell a little bit about Conexxus. We'll have the presentation, and then finally, we'll have the question and answers. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. So it's posted on YouTube and it's also posted on the Conexxus website. If you stay through the whole presentation, there will be a survey link at the end, and we ask you to please complete the survey. It's very, very short. It's only 3 or 4 questions. And once you complete the survey, then there is a link to obtain a copy of the presentation. All attendees are on mute, and so we ask that you ask your questions in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar section. Today we are being hosted by Allie Russell of Conexxus. My name is Cara Gunderson. I am the chairman of the Data Security Standards Committee. I'm the moderator. Our speakers today are Chris Buccolo, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Market Strategy for ControlScan, as well as Todd Rosen, who is the Senior Director of Petro Sales Support and Service with Verifone. A little bit more about Chris. He is a Conexxus Data Security Standards Committee member. He is an NAMA Data Security Standards Committee member as well. He is on the PCI Council for the Small Merchant Task Force. He is a member of the Merchant Acquirers Committee Education Committee, and very often you will hear Chris speak and write on such topics as PCI. Co-presenting with Chris today is Todd Rosen. Todd has more than 20 years experience in the industry. He is responsible for the Verifone authorized service contractors. He is also responsible for all field support and training. And he's been involved with the QIR project since 2015. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. So basically, it sets standards for the petroleum industry, and which is saves all of us a heap of money, because we have merchants like myself who are able to utilize point-of-sale vendors and other third-party service providers using the same technology for connectivity, for that data exchange, also for security. And Conexxus was the very first standards body to put together a mobile payment standard. Conexxus provides vision to identify emerging technology and trends, and definitely an advocate for the industry. We have other webinars coming up. And so in June, we have a webinar on can we leverage data science to improve retail data security. In July, we have the roadmap to a vulnerability disclosure program. August, moving towards outdoor EMV. September, we are still working on securing that presentation. There will not be a webinar in October because of the Tech Edge series at NACS. And then in November, we'll have building a scalable security engineering team. As I mentioned, the Tech Edge is at the next show, which is October 7th through the 10th and 20th in Las Vegas. So, and I would like to note that the majority of the Conexxus folks, like you saw the webinar schedule, Chris, Todd, and myself were all volunteers for Conexxus, and so Conexxus is very much a volunteer-driven organization. So we do rely on our volunteers, and so we're very appreciative for everybody who's attending today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Todd. Thanks, gentlemen. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge today.
Great, thanks, Cara, and thanks again for the opportunity. Let me add my welcome to everyone to the webinar today. And this is a webinar that I would say is not content intensive, but the content that we're going to share we think is very important and timely. So we believe there'll be plenty of time at the end for the interactive question and answer period. So as Cara mentioned, as soon as you can, you start thinking up some questions. Go ahead and start entering those in the chat section, and we'll get those answered either along the way or at the end. So just a couple highlights here. We're going to talk about where QIR has been. Todd has been very involved in QIR in the past, and I've been involved as well. We're going to talk about the updates to the program. And then we're going to do something I think is interesting. We're going to talk about a breach case involving a larger hospitality organization where some of the groups worked with the QIR and others did not, to show a little bit about the difference in their experiences. And we'll be giving you a link to some resources, including FAQs that the council has on QIR. And again, we'll hopefully have plenty of time at the end for some questions. Just a little bit again, QIR is qualified integrator and reseller. This program was created with absolutely the best of intentions based on breaches that were occurring and risks that were occurring with how things got integrated or installed, or the support with things like remote access. But, you know, so the goal of the program was to help really address a broader problem, which is you have third parties who are involved in very critical activities, right? But they're not necessarily on the radar screen. So you had the issue of, do they understand the payments security issues enough? And is there accountability? And that all comes into play. So Todd will talk a little bit more about this, but the program struggled to get traction in the early going. It was pretty broad in scope, and it only applied to situations where there was a validated payment application involved. Passing the exam was very challenging if you didn't already have a certain knowledge of payments and payment security. And again, the main areas involved here are integration, installation, and support. So Todd, I'm going to ask you to spend a few minutes and talk a little bit about where we are and how we got there.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of, I think, a wide range of folks that are interested in the QIR program and want some additional information on it. You know, really from a view today of where we are, and since 2014, when we've really started looking at the QIR program, there are only 21 active petroleum companies with QIR certified technicians. So when you think about that, you know, you kind of look at it and wonder, why are there so few companies and technicians? One, the industry adoption. Some of it is, you spoke quickly about it previously, really around all of the manufacturers coming together to come up with a standard that they could use to get techs certified or help techs get certified. You know, the cost was really much higher than it is today. So with the new announcement and program, which is we'll talk about, it becomes much more affordable for companies and technicians to get certified. You know, there was a lack of marketing around the program itself too, where I think the card brands and the issuers were basically able to provide information, but it really didn't trickle down to the field like it should have. And as I mentioned earlier, there was no buy-in from the POS providers, manufacturers, and service providers. And there is a lot of training that goes on in these service organizations. A lot of our Verifone authorized service contractors, Gilbarco authorized service contractors, and Wayne authorized service organizations, all of those folks have multiple training that takes place. Many of them have their own training organizations. And so having another training to look after, which involves so much, was very difficult to get adopted. So, you know, a recommendation and plan from us, and especially since we've been involved for a while, is to create a manufacturers panel that would cover the majority of the POS and software providers in the Petroleum group. You know, that would include people like Wayne and Gilbarco, along with Verifone, to help steer that program down to the technicians so everybody would be covered. And mandate that new technicians and certifications from the POS providers include QIR. Today, if Verifone has any new authorized service contractors that come on board, they must meet the QIR certification. Do we have the next
I think
slide? What?
I think Chris might be on mute.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm not on mute. I went to the next slide. Service contractor up.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So basically, from an update from our organization, the North American Petroleum Service authorized service contractors are made up of about 500 companies across the United States. When you look at just really mainly petroleum organizations. And that count of technicians servicing the landscape of convenience store and fueling sites is approximately 3,000 full-time career technicians. So that's a lot of technicians out there servicing sites. While we are the largest POS provider to the market with an 85% share of those authorized technicians. So what this means is if you look at across Wayne, Gilbarco, and Verifone, there's a bleed of about 85%, meaning whether you are solely Gilbarco certified or you are solely Wayne certified, 85% of that mix is made up of Verifone technicians. So we do provide software across all major brands and networks.
All right, thanks, Todd. I think what we'll do now is we'll go into the updated QIR program, and we'll go into some of those details to hopefully get everybody up to speed. Just a couple things to keep in mind here. Just want to remind everyone that in January 31st of 2017, Visa came out with a requirement that in these situations, merchants must use qualified integrators and resellers when it involves the installation or integration of PA-DSS validated applications. And we will, again, at the end of this presentation, the resources page will give you a link to that Visa bulletin if you want to read it, because it gets into some of the more nuances about what does qualify and what doesn't. And we'll also talk a little bit about that before we get there. But again, installation has been an area where if it's not done correctly in relation to these security aspects, that is where we have seen some issues. And on the forensic side, end-to-end encryption type of solutions, although the encryption part tends to be very effective, there have been issues with back-end configuration on that particular acquirer's version. So if we're going to see problem, a lot of times we're going to see it with the configuration. And then later we have the issue of remote access, which we'll talk about from a support standpoint. I know one of the things we've stressed in the past is that in-house technicians at the merchant level do not have to get certified, but there's definitely benefits to doing it and being able to say you followed best practices. We'll talk a little bit about that, a little more about that as we go along, but that's just to set the stage. So the actual new program, which came out on March 14th, involves really streamlining. So reduced cost, it's down to $100 per individual that goes through it, and it's going from a 3-year recertification to an annual recertification. But the course is very short. It's 1.5 to 2 hours with a 30-minute exam. So really when you look at this, you're talking about it's broader in that it now covers all applications, all payment applications, regardless of whether they're on the PA-DSS validated list. But the program isn't as deep. It's not going into as many aspects and deeper into those aspects. So it's focused on what I always refer to as the big three, which are the leading causes these days of problems in the retail world. You've got weak password practice, you've got your insecure remote access, and your unpatched or outdated software. And a very high percentage of retail-related breaches today involve problems with remote access. That is a given, and we'll talk about that a little bit with the breach study that we're going to cover here. But you know, from a merchant perspective, you heard Todd talk about the numbers. The increased pool of people that are trained on these critical security controls is going to make a big difference to the industry overall.
And Chris, isn't part of the appeal of the new program too is that it's all online. You don't have to go to a test center anymore, so it's much more efficient as well. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. Good point. It's estimated that it'll take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours. It is all online. The program through the provider, it's a very large provider that's been doing this a long time. It works really efficiently, and again, it ends with a 30-minute exam. And again, overcoming one of those problems, not just convenience, but the issue of if you don't come from the payments world, it can be really difficult in the past to pass. And this will improve rates of passage by a really high percentage. Somebody asked me recently if they're going to track that, and I believe they are, and I have followed up with them to ask at the council if they're going to provide more information on that going forward. Good point.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add too is just the fact that that folks that have been primarily focused on point of sale installations and field dispenser work and all of that has not really been introduced to the network and the network engineering side. And I know that even from my own team here is that the knowledge that was gained as a result of this, like securing remote access and the importance, like you said, focusing on the 3 leading causes of the payment data breaches, the knowledge level was just amazing. So it was really good to have that knowledge come in house when my person here did their QIR cert.
Great. That's good to know. So it sounds like for that person, like a light bulb went off and a whole new level of awareness that didn't exist before really came into being in your organization. Exactly.
And understanding why things are the way that they are in the PADSS and how important it is to follow that. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, it sort of dovetails into this next slide. Again, when we're looking at data on breaches, a very high percentage these days, maybe 95%, are SMBs. So with that being the case, it's important when you have programs to educate and assist, smaller players, resellers, marketing customers who may have 10 locations, may have 5 locations or even less, that they're actually sitting in the crosshairs of where a lot of these breaches are occurring, knowing that it's important to have education and really solid information around these areas, and the process of what the QIR program does will be helpful to everyone in the ecosystem. As more and more people go through it, they'll be able to educate each other, whether in-house or externally, because these features are limited in what you have to deal with. So it won't be that difficult to have education and more awareness be created around that. So I think this bodes well for the industry, and hopeful to see some really good traction as we move ahead here. Just a couple things. I mentioned that Visa bulletin that we'll give you a link to, but from a Visa perspective, who's been very active in this whole area, as far as any confusion, the programs like QIR, everything PCI related comes from the PCI Council, but they're not an enforcement body. They're only a standards body. So when it comes to the major card brands like Visa, they do give you some good direction on when QIR might not apply. And it really wasn't intended for standalone devices where you're not allowing remote access and things like that. Also, if you have a vendor that's really supporting something that's ancillary, but it's integrated into the POS system or the network that it's part of, if there's proper segmentation in there, and it can't be part of a pivot attack, if you will, over to the cardholder data environment, then you can make the argument that QIR would not apply in that situation. So if you have any questions about that, I would specifically go to your acquirer and or your PCI security type of provider to get more clarification on that. Because one thing we know for sure, and I know Cara will agree with this, is that there's plenty of gray areas out there. And as soon as you say, this is a given, you're already in trouble. And I think we can all probably agree with that.
For sure.
We've also been, I just included this bullet at the bottom. I use this when I'm talking to acquirers and payments companies, because I think it would be best practice if acquirers would also go through QIR certification. They are eligible to do that. And I have some clients that are acquirers who've done it. And I can tell you that same light bulb went off that Cara was talking about makes a huge difference in relating to their customers and giving guidance. So again, I think QIR should become a pretty ubiquitous training platform in the industry. And at $100 a person, there's not much obstacle to that from that occurring. So now we're going to go into something that I have found pretty interesting. I went to my forensic friends at Sikich. I actually used to work there, and I went on some forensic investigations when I was there and learned as much as I could about it. And I asked them if they had any good examples of a situation with a breach where you could show maybe the difference between those that worked with QIRs and those that did not. And one of my colleagues put this case study together and made it generic for us, and I think it's really interesting. His focus is primarily on retail breaches, and he outlined one with a large hospitality organization that had all these multiple reseller groups all across the country. But because of geography and their requirements, each organization mandated a specific point of sale system from that may have different resellers. So they were buying the same system, but through different resellers. And in this case, the corporate office had remote access in place to every store, regardless of where they were located and what system they were using. Every store had this in place. And then what happened, as often is the case, is the merchant isn't the first one to find out about a breach. It can take many months. 3 major U.S. bank issuers identified a large amount of fraudulent activity, and of course indicated that a forensics study or investigation should be done. And the result was something I have never seen this kind of analysis done before. I was really excited about it when he put it together. And the main points that I want to make here are that you see a lot of rhetoric in the world these days about, well, maybe you can't stop an attack. Maybe if they really want to get in, maybe there's some degree of success they might find. But what it highlights on the left side, where they were working with a QIR company, is that the hackers got in initially, but because of the awareness of the vulnerabilities that could be there and the way they addressed those vulnerabilities with things like firewall rules and malware tools, systems to patch against those malware tools, I should say, they really didn't do any damage. They didn't exfiltrate data and get it out of there in the resellers' environments, customers' environments who had the QIR process in place. They were hurt by what happened at the home office with the remote access, but the damage was minimized and there was not a major breach as a result. If you look over on the right side, the attacker was able to get data out, and they even installed a secondary tool for later use. This is very common in these retail breaches. They try to keep a backdoor open, and we have seen repeat breaches occur in the retail world even after the first one was fully investigated. Now, that may be a matter of whether or not they actually made the changes that were recommended or didn't make those changes in some cases. But I think you can see, and the other thing that struck me here was, if you look down at the bottom on the right side under non-QIR, it says, they got upset about the liability and they lawyered up and they didn't assist in the PFI investigation. And then I started to think about the tension that must have created within that overall organization, that they were at odds with each other because of the different paths that they had taken. And this group did not agree to participate and assist, and that hurt the overall effort. So I thought this was a really good case to outline why QIR matters, if you will. And I don't know, Todd or Cara, do you have anything to add to that? I know, Cara, you already sort of covered. You wanted to stress again that when your gentleman in charge of point of sale went through QIR, the whole world sort of opened up to him in terms of things he wasn't worried about before.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I think this just epitomizes the need for the knowledge. And as you mentioned, I mean, there's been several breaches where you think, well, the transaction is going from the point of sale directly to the payment processor, so therefore my risk is very small. But we've seen numerous franchise type breaches in very, very popular QSRs, whereas it was configured wrong or allowed remote access, and therefore individual sites were able to be breached because the hackers found the commonality of that setup, and therefore were able to do multi location attacks. So
right.
Again.
So even if you're installing something that has advanced technology, being able to make sure you understand the requirements and that you follow the implementation guide of that technology is critical to actually warding off the attacks that are ultimately going to come. So that's where we see the biggest difference today between those that have gone through it and those that have not in some cases. So this is interesting. As this came from my same friend in the forensics world, I just thought this was interesting. QIRs are usually more active in the industry. I had never really thought about that. But I think what happens is that once they go through the program, they feel connected to the PCI and security world a little bit more. QIRs realize that security, one kind of security, if you will, it's not one approach. There's no silver bullet. I think we all get that. It has to be a multi-layered approach. But this number 3, this third bullet, really struck me again. I've studied forensics and breach statistics for a long time. And one of the things that I've always learned from a lot of these studies is that if you do more to plan and have incident response plans and things like that, you can minimize and get the cost part and get through it faster. So faster and less cost. And what organization isn't about that these days? So there are good financial and brand damage reasons to minimize the data breach scenarios. And as he wanted to stress again, that the initial setup of a system is often where things go, as he puts it, terribly wrong. Well, that's definitely a QSA's view, right, of the world. But there's food for thought in here for all of us. And I think, again, it's been proven that a proper and timely response to a breach scenario will lessen losses and get you back up and running faster. So I'd like to just sort of sum this up. Again, not the most content-intensive webinar, but important points. What are the primary changes? We already went through those, but shorter course, all online, as Cara said, less expensive, annual recertification, expanded to include non-PADSS listed applications. Again, we'll talk about these big 3 till doomsday. People sometimes say to me, why do you keep talking about the same things? And of course, your response is, well, when it gets better or goes away, then we'll stop talking about those. And as we shift to e-commerce, once chip card is ubiquitous in the United States and more people are using encryption technologies, we'll see this shift more to the e-commerce world. And but for today, this is still in the United States. This is still the main story. and as we mentioned, the $100 fee. So those are, and again, I will give you a link to the FAQs from the council on the QIR program, so you can read all of them if you want to do that. Now, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the merchant benefits. And I asked Cara to weigh in on this to give you the perspective of somebody that's sort of living this every day out there in the point of sale world. And I thought Cara could have a few summary comments to help us tie this together.
Thanks, Chris. And I'd kind of mentioned this before, but part of the QIR training stresses the importance of following the PADSS implementation guide. And in Petroleum, you know, it seems that we're all installing the same point of sale systems, the same software versions, but everybody's configuration or network hookups or where the plugs go and how everything is kind of connected together is different depending on the brand. And so it is really, really crucial to make sure that everybody's following the PADSS guide. And I guess one of the big takeaways that I had when I first looked at the QIR program is that they say from a QIR certified tech perspective, you create this list that you need to follow, and then you have the merchant sign off. So from a QIR, that's huge because that says, hey, I followed through and did what I was supposed to. So merchant, you know, we're going to sign this together because I have followed this guide. And so from a technician perspective, that's a really good kind of you know, it helps kind of cover things from your aspect. Now, conversely, on the merchant side, it also helps me to say, look, you know what, my tech is signing off saying that I say he, but they promised that they followed that PADSS guide. And so, the point of sale vendors, as part of their payment application data security standards requirement, or the PCI requirements for payment applications, is that they have to put together this payment application guide to make sure that their point of sale is secure. So that's why you have to follow that PADSS implementation guide and to properly secure. I already talked about the knowledge and the checklist as well, but it's, you know, talking with some of the techs out there, it's really good practice to if I were a tech, what I would do in their shoes is I would have my QIR list and I would say, use it almost as a training tool, because if you do all these things and you hand it off to the merchant or the cashier or the store manager and say, here, sign this, you know, you might get 50% that sign it and 50% that don't, depending on your relationship with them, or you might get a higher percentage. But if you actually use that QIR checklist as a training tool, and that will help remind you to go through all of those items on the checklist, because then you're going to get buy-in from the person that's signing off. So from a tech perspective, you actually go through this and you get the merchant to sign off. A lot of folks I'm hearing are actually taking pictures of the connections, of how things are configured. You know, we've seen in just to keep on file, because we know that sometimes you've got somebody who says, oh, we've got a new device that we want to plug in, and it's plug and play because it's going to do some other type of program, or it's going to capture this data or that data or whatever the case is. So then plugins kind of get changed, and unbeknownst to the person who was doing the changes is that they might have then put their location in jeopardy for a remote breach. So it's really important that merchants and techs work together, and I think most of the companies that I've spoken with are doing the pictures now, and it's a great leave behind for the merchant as well. So
yeah, those are excellent points. That's really great practical advice. That should be helpful to everybody. Do either of you, Cara or Todd, have anything to add before we go into the Q&A period?
The only thing I would add, Chris, great job putting that together, is that there are quite a few, was peaking, QIRs that are actually on the call. I noticed there were a couple from some of the companies that have been certified. So maybe when we get into the Q&A, we may may hear some feedback from them as well.
Oh, great. Yeah, that would be great and probably helpful for everyone if we could do that. All right, again, just about the resources. This is the Council's website at the top. The second one is the FAQs for the new QIR program. That's a really good document. It's concise. It's about 3 pages of information. Really well done, really clear. And then the visa bulletin I mentioned that makes it a requirement back in January of 2017 to use a QIR when it's applicable. So those are all available to you. And then we'll see what kind of questions we have queued up at this point.
Great. Thanks, Todd and Chris. Thank you very much for sharing. You guys have a lot of knowledge, and we sure appreciate the fact that you volunteer for Conexxus and shared your knowledge today. The webinar, just as a reminder, use the question panel in the GoToWebinar to type your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. Please, no vendor-specific questions if you can, and then we will answer your questions that way. I would also note that if you complete the survey at the end of the webinar here, and it's just 3 or 4 questions, it's not very long, then you will get a link to be able to download this particular presentation. So we do not have any questions at this time, and I think unless there are any, then we can wrap it up here. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. And again, we'll be posting this webinar in its entirety on YouTube. If you complete the survey at the end, you can get a copy of the presentation. And we sure appreciate everybody attending. And Todd and Chris, thanks again for sharing your knowledge. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.